The recession of 1969 and 1970 was a small recession, but it did have a big impact on the future of America's economy. To give some background, the first moon landing occurred on July 1969. There are several energy crises since 1967 in the Middle East, such as the Saudi Arabia crisis. Also, the Vietnam War was raging on from 1955 to 1975. Woodstock happened in 1969, where everyone partied and had a good time, and Richard Nixon was president during this time and this recession. And in the corner, you can see some fashion. The main causes and contributing factors were inflation, the Federal Reserve interest rates, and fiscal tightening. To begin, spending was 2 times the estimated rate of expansion, if you consider the growth in labor force, capital, equipment, and technology. And this shows in the rise of inflation from 1.2% in 1964 to 5.84% in 1970. Before 1964, it was pretty steady. It was around 1.1. It remained pretty steady, and then around 1967, it began to spike to 2%, and then 3%, and then 1969, it began to be 4. It just kept getting larger and larger at a very high rate. Next, the Federal Reserve, to pay back money for the deficit spending that they were doing in the Vietnam War, because they were spending a lot of money to fight, they raised the interest rates. This caused consumers that took out loans and borrowed money to pay back more than they had originally believed, and therefore they had less disposable income and wouldn't spend as much, and that also hurts the economy. Next is fiscal tightening. The government also, to pay back for this deficit spending, they began to lower their spending rates in other areas and began raising their tax rates in order to improve their own finances. How bad was it? It wasn't that bad compared to the other recessions. GDP decreased from 4.9% growth in 1968 to a 3.1% growth in 1969 and a 0.2% growth in 1970. That might sound very bad, but you have to keep in mind the other negative percent growth rates in other recessions. Also, inflation, once again, was part of the reason. It was one of the contributing factors. So, it increased from 0.4% from 1969 and 1970 and reduced after, which is good, obviously until the next recession in the mid-70s. Unemployment also rose from 3.5% in 1969 to 6.1% in 1970, which isn't very good. Inflation and unemployment were believed to go hand in hand and have an inverse relationship. It was believed that inflation was okay because it meant the economy was growing and that unemployment would be low. It was an inverse relationship, so basically the increase of demand would make the price of goods go up, which would make firms want to expand and hire additional employees, which would create additional demand. So basically, increased demand would lead to increased prices, which would lead to firms wanting to hire more people and therefore less unemployment. But this was not the case. The increased inflation led to increased unemployment in this recession. International components. The United States had several things going on during this time. There were several oil crises in other parts of the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia, just raised oil prices and furthered the inflation rates. Because when the price of oil increases, everything else increases. That's just because oil is a very big factor of life at this point. You need oil to make almost everything. Oil was getting slightly expensive. That also increased inflation. Also, the Vietnam War was occurring in Vietnam, and lots of deficit spending. Deficit spending is when you spend money that you don't have the revenue for, which was causing a lot of turmoil in the American economy. All in all, not much was done. The consumers, there were lots of protests for employment because many factories and jobs were not there for people. Although the fiscal policy and the monetary policy were part of the problem, it hurt in the short term because the government was tightening down on what they were doing and helping people with, But in the end, it really helped the economy to bounce back much quicker than if it were to not have happened, or if instead of tightening, they would have increased the amount of monetary flow by putting more money into the economy. That would have just made it more worse, and honestly would have made the mid-70s recession much worse. Lasting impacts. President Johnson didn't want to raise taxes after this because he saw the effects of the recession, even though, in my opinion, it wasn't that bad. The oil crises, they were still going on. It also put a negative outlook on the oil crises because it raised the prices of everything and people could buy less, and that was impacting everyone's personal lives. So people were much more against conflict in the Middle East. This also gave a negative outlook on deficit spending because they associated the 69-70 recession with deficit spending. And this kind of set up Ford for the mid-70s recession because of all the deficit spending and as well as the rest of the Vietnam War. These are my sources.